August 15, 2021. The Taliban entered Kabul. Many residents believed the era of open warfare had ended. They expected stability. In reality, the violence simply changed its form. It moved from the battlefields into the homes and streets. How did the new regime enforce its will? The world saw official press conferences, but hidden cameras captured the truth. The footage shows a woman walking alone in a public square. Two men approach her. They carry heavy wooden sticks and rubber cables. Without a word, they begin the strike. The sound of the first blow echoes against the stone walls. This was not a trial. It was an immediate punishment for traveling without a male guardian. The camera records another scene, a secret school in a basement. 12 girls sit on a cold concrete floor. They whisper their lessons to avoid detection by the religious police patrolling outside. This is now a crime. Discovery means imprisonment for the teacher and public lashing for the students. At first glance, a city returning to normal life. But in reality, a coordinated campaign of gender-based erasure. Soldiers move through the markets. They paint over the faces of women on storefront advertisements. They use black spray paint to turn human features into dark voids. They remove signs for beauty salons. They dismantle the infrastructure of female public life. Events accelerated. New decrees appeared every week. Women lost the right to visit parks. Then they lost the right to attend universities. Finally, they were barred from working for international aid groups. The footage reveals a cruelty that is systematic. It is not random anger. It is a calculated policy. One clip shows a protest in the streets. A small group of women hold signs. Taliban fighters do not negotiate. They fire their rifles into the air. They use pepper spray at point-blank range. They seize the cameras, but some lenses remained hidden. These recordings documented the kidnappings. Black SUVs stop in the middle of the night. Men in turbans drag activists from their beds. No warrants are issued. No records are kept. There was no turning back. The silent tension in the cities is measurable. The streets are half empty. The laughter is gone. Only the sound of boots on pavement remains. These uncensored files prove that the war did not end. It simply became a siege against half the population. Thus, the evidence was gathered. December 1979. The Soviet Union moved its 40th Army across the border. This was not a sudden collapse. Afghanistan had been bleeding for decades. The goal was simple: prop up a failing communist regime in Kabul. What followed was a 10-year slaughter. It reached into every village and every house. Why did the Soviet plan fail? They expected a quick victory, but reality was different. They faced a wall of resistance that turned the country into a graveyard. The footage from the era shows the scale. T-62 tanks burning on mountain passes. Mi-24 helicopters falling from the sky. On the ground, the destruction was absolute. Soviet jets dropped high-explosive bombs on irrigation systems. Soldiers burned wheat fields. They mined the roads. Infrastructure vanished. February 15, 1989. The last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge. The war was over, but the cost was astronomical. 1 million Afghans were dead. Millions more carried shrapnel in their bodies or walked on prosthetic limbs. Families fled with only the clothes on their backs. 5 million people crossed the borders into Pakistan and Iran. They didn't find safety. They found mud huts and overcrowded tents. In these camps, a generation grew up. No schools, no jobs, only the daily struggle for bread and water. But this was only the beginning. April 1992, the communist government in Kabul finally fell. People expected peace. Instead, they got a civil war. Former allies who fought the Soviets now turned their guns on each other. They fought for blocks. They fought for single street corners. The sound of Grad rockets became the soundtrack of the city. Kabul transformed into a killing field. Between 1992 and 1996, 50,000 civilians died in the capital alone. Artillery shells leveled hospitals and schools. The rule of law disappeared. In its place stood the checkpoint. Armed men stopped every car and every bus. They dragged passengers into the street. They searched homes at midnight. There were no courts and no appeals. How did women survive? At first glance, they didn't. In reality, they disappeared from public life. Armed groups kidnapped women from markets. Fighters forced young girls into marriage at gunpoint. Mothers locked their daughters inside. Education stopped because the walk to school became a death trap. The country was broken. The stage was set for the Taliban. Families stayed indoors to protect their children. Law disappeared. Ordinary citizens felt trapped between rival factions that showed zero concern for civilian life. The exhaustion turned into a deep, heavy desperation. They did not want slogans. They did not want democracy. They wanted the shelling to stop. They wanted any force to bring order to the streets. This void created a massive opening. Into that opening stepped the Taliban. 1994. Late autumn in Kandahar. The city was a ruin, broken by years of urban combat. Kandahar had become the capital of chaos. Warlords set up illegal checkpoints on every road. Truck drivers faced daily robberies at gunpoint. Girls were dragged out of schools. Families remained powerless against the local militias. Who were these new fighters? Most were very young. Many had spent their childhoods in refugee camps across the border in Pakistan. They had never known peace. Their fathers and brothers were dead. For these young men, the world was a binary. There was right and wrong. There was obedience and punishment. The movement had one leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar. He was a veteran of the war against the Soviet Union. One of his eyes had been lost in a blast during the fighting. He lived in silence and avoided the public eye. At first glance, a quiet cleric, but in reality, a shadow commander. This mystery built his legend. His followers believed he was a man chosen to restore discipline. They gave him the title Amir al-Mu'minin. It was a signal of absolute religious authority. It demanded total obedience. The footage from the time shows a broken landscape. Burnt-out tanks sit on the roadsides. Men in black turbans carry Kalashnikovs through the markets. There is no music. There is no laughter. Only the sound of boots on dry earth. But this was only the beginning. The movement moved fast. They seized the city and executed the local warlords. The checkpoints vanished. The robbery stopped. Order returned. But it was cold and absolute. There was no turning back. Thus, the new regime began its march. Safety on the roads, an end to corruption, justice based on strict religious law. These were the promises. At first, many locals supported the movement. They watched as fighters disarmed local warlords. Robberies stopped. Illegal checkpoints vanished from the highways. For a population exhausted by constant fear, this looked like relief. But this order came with a heavy cost. September 27, 1996. Taliban units entered Kabul. The city was drained by years of civil war and offered almost no resistance. Pickup trucks filled with armed men moved through the streets quickly. They headed straight for the United Nations compound. Inside, former President Mohammad Najibullah had been hiding for 4 years. The fighters did not wait. They dragged Najibullah and his brother out into the street. The footage from that day is grim. The men were beaten and executed. Their bodies were hoisted onto a traffic light pillar in the center of the city. It was a signal to the entire country. There was no turning back. Within 48 hours, life for women changed completely. New decrees were announced over the radio and enforced immediately. The rules were absolute. Women were banned from leaving their homes without a male relative to escort them. Across the country, the gates of girls' schools were locked. They did not reopen. The economic impact was instant. Female teachers were barred from their classrooms. Women working in government offices, international aid organizations, and hospitals were dismissed on the spot. Journalists were removed from newsrooms. Thousands of families lost their primary income in a single afternoon. How did they maintain control? A specialized force was created to patrol the population. It was called the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. The visual is consistent in every city. Ministry officers patrolled the streets in white vehicles. They carried wooden sticks, thick rubber cables, and leather whips. They stopped women at random for inspections. If a burqa was deemed too short, the officers used the whips. If a woman's shoes made a clicking sound on the pavement, punishment followed. The sound of the cables became a part of daily life. This was the new order. 1997. Silence became a survival tactic. If a woman raised her voice or showed signs of visible anxiety, the consequences were immediate. An accusation of bad behavior led to a public beating. There were no warnings. There were no appeals. The punishment took place on the pavement in front of crowds. Streets turned into zones of terror. Markets were no longer for commerce. Women learned to keep their eyes on the ground and increase their pace. They tried to become invisible, but visibility was unavoidable. Hospitals became centers of terminal neglect. The regime enforced a total ban on female doctors. Simultaneously, male doctors were forbidden from touching female patients. The system collapsed. Pregnant women arrived at hospital gates only to be forced back into the street. A minor infection turned into a death sentence. Childbirth became a lethal event. By 1997, international health monitors recorded a surge in casualties. Maternal mortality reached 1,600 deaths for every 100,000 births. Many women never made it to a clinic. They bled out in silence on their home floors because the fear of the street was greater than the fear of death. But this was only the beginning. The Taliban moved their violence from hidden alleys into the center of the city. Public execution and torture became the primary tools of governance. Fear was the policy. If the population witnessed the agony of others in the bright sun, they stayed obedient. The footage shows the transformation of urban life. Busy intersections and squares turned into stages for the religious police. One location stood out. No place became more notorious than Ghazi Stadium in Kabul. The crowd watched from the bleachers. There was no escape. Ghazi Stadium, a name that still triggers silence in Kabul. Today, it hosts sports. But 25 years ago, the grass served a different purpose. It was a stage for public executions. Why did the crowds come? It was not by choice. The Taliban scheduled these events for Friday afternoons. This was the peak of the week, immediately following the main prayer services at the local mosques. The timing was calculated for maximum visibility. Taliban officials used loudspeakers to broadcast the announcements. They patrolled the streets, shouting orders for the public to assemble. It worked. Witness accounts describe tens of thousands of people packed into the concrete stands. Men and children sat in the heat, waiting for the show of force to begin. The spectacle targeted women most of all. Guards dragged them into the center of the field in front of the masses. The list of offenses was long. Adultery, running away from home, disobeying a father or brother. These were the crimes that led to the stadium floor. There were no defense lawyers. There were no appeals. Taliban judges and local commanders delivered verdicts in minutes. The process was swift and final. Once the sentence was read, the violence began immediately. November 16, 1999. This date marks one of the most documented killings in the stadium's history. A woman named Zarmina was the target. She was accused of killing her husband with a hammer during a domestic dispute. The Taliban did not act in haste. They kept Zarmina in a cell for nearly 3 years. They waited for the right moment to make an example of her. It would be the first public execution of a woman under the new regime. The footage shows the scene. A vehicle drives onto the dirt track and stops. Zarmina is let out. She wears a bright blue burqa that masks her face and body. 2 female guards, also covered in burqas, grip her arms. They march her toward the center of the pitch. The crowd falls silent. The sound of wind across the microphones is the only noise. Zarmina is forced to her knees. A soldier stands behind her with a Kalashnikov rifle. The executioner raises the weapon. There is no hesitation. One shot to the back of the head. The blue fabric collapses into the dust. The message was clear to everyone in the stands. This was the new law of Afghanistan. One young Taliban fighter stood behind her. He held a Soviet-made rifle. When the woman was forced to kneel, The gunman fired 3 shots into her head. The execution was public. Many families brought their children to watch from the stadium seats. The Taliban had broadcast the event on the radio days in advance. The footage shows a woman in the crowd hides a small camera under her clothes. She filmed the killing at the risk of her own life. Later, the tape was smuggled across the border and broadcast globally. It became the primary evidence of how the regime used public death to control the population. But inside Afghanistan, the reaction was different. People had grown used to the violence. It was not support, it was survival. Openly refusing to watch or criticizing the act meant immediate punishment for the entire family. There was no other choice. The stadium killings did not end with Zarmina. Ghazi Stadium became a factory for public trauma. The list of penalties grew. Amputations for theft, public floggings for immodesty, new executions every week. But this was only the beginning. Human Rights Watch documented the patterns. Amnesty International recorded the data. Patrols stopped women randomly in the streets. They used sticks and cables. Age offered no protection. Teenagers were beaten as often as the elderly. In the frame, a crowded bazaar in Herat. The year was 2000. A woman in her 30s is talking to a friend. She laughs. For the Taliban, this was a moral crime. Witnesses watched as men struck her with heavy cables. They did not stop until she collapsed onto the dirt. No one moved to help. The crowd remained silent. Helping a victim meant becoming the next target. The logic was simple. One act of mercy resulted in 2 beatings. The psychological impact was immediate. After witnessing a beating, women stayed inside their homes for weeks. Some never left again. Kabul, once a city of movement, became a city of closed doors. Events accelerated. Kabul changed overnight. Women who previously worked in offices, shopped in markets, and studied in universities vanished. The streets became a space where women were largely invisible. The Taliban did not hide their methods. They used violence as a public signal. Beatings were meant to be witnessed by the crowd. But there was a contradiction. Cameras were strictly banned. The regime declared photography and video recording immoral. Anyone caught with a camera faced immediate consequences: arrest, severe beatings, long prison sentences, in some cases, execution. The regime wanted the fear to spread, but they wanted no permanent record of the brutality. Some people refused to obey. They took the risk. One woman secretly filmed the execution of Zarmina. However, the most critical evidence came from a group called RAWA. This was the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. It was established in 1977. They had spent decades opposing both the Soviet occupation and Taliban fundamentalism. During the late 1990s, RAWA members turned into underground journalists. They hid cameras under their burqas. They moved through the city, knowing a single mistake meant death. In 1999, they captured a specific scene in Kabul. The footage shows a woman in the street. She lifts her burqa for a moment to beg for food. The reaction was instant. Taliban officers approached. The video records the sound of impact. They struck her repeatedly with heavy wooden sticks. Bystanders stood still. No one moved to help. The footage shows the absolute paralysis of the public. RAWA did not keep the tapes in Kabul. They smuggled the film across the border into Pakistan. From there, it reached the hands of international journalists. Human rights groups studied the frames. The United Nations received the files. For the global community, this was the first undeniable proof. It was no longer just a rumor. This was the reality of daily life under the regime. Inside Afghanistan, the situation remained stagnant. The beatings did not stop. Public violence was the regime's most effective tool of control. They used it to maintain order through terror. Then came September 11, 2001. 4 planes were hijacked. The attacks in the United States shocked the world. The era of isolation for the Taliban was over. Events accelerated. October 7, 2001. On this day, the first missiles struck Afghanistan. The Taliban regime had made a choice. They provided a safe haven for Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network. When the United States demanded his surrender, the Taliban leadership refused. They did not move. They did not negotiate. This refusal triggered a global military response. Why did the Taliban risk everything for one man? At first glance, a matter of religious principle, but in reality, a strategic blunder that ended their rule. The air campaign began at night. Tomahawk missiles and precision bombs hit military bases, communication hubs, and training camps. The sound of explosions echoed through the streets of Kabul and Kandahar. In the north, the Northern Alliance saw their opening. These local fighters, backed by Western air power, began a rapid ground offensive. They moved south on trucks and horseback, capturing one outpost after another. There was no turning back. November 13, 2001. Northern Alliance troops entered Kabul. The city was quiet. The Taliban government had vanished overnight. They abandoned their desks, their vehicles, and their weapons. By early December, the entire regime collapsed. Senior leaders and thousands of fighters did not surrender. They packed their gear and fled toward the jagged peaks of the Tora Bora Mountains. Others crossed the porous border into Pakistan. The visual record of the city changed instantly. For the first time in 5 years, women walked the streets of the capital alone. They removed their heavy face coverings. Girls carrying notebooks walked into schools that had been padlocked since 1996. Hospitals and news stations called their female employees back to their desks. The cameras recorded a city breathing again. But the liberation revealed a dark archive. Human rights investigators found the evidence of 5 years of brutality. The footage shows public executions in sports stadiums. The audio captures the sound of lashes in city squares. Secret recordings from hidden cameras documented beatings of women for minor dress code violations. These archives prove that from 1996 to 2001, the population lived in a state of constant surveillance. But this was only the beginning of a longer war. The victory was not absolute. The Taliban had lost the cities, but they kept the shadows. In rural provinces like Helmand, Kandahar, and Uruzgan, the movement found new life. They moved through the poppy fields and mountain passes, far from the reach of the new government. They established hidden training camps and rebuilt their command structures. They recruited new fighters and waited. The war had transitioned, but it had not ended.